A black man named Jamal West is wrongfully arrested by two racist police officers, Riley and Jenkins. But when Jamal's true identity is revealed, the entire police station is left speechless. What happened and who really is Jamal West that made the whole police station suddenly realize they were facing not just a legal case, but a monumental reckoning? Let's find out. But before we get into the story, comment below where you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. It was a typical morning in the heart of the city. The sun was just beginning to peek over the tall buildings, casting long shadows on the bustling streets below. The sound of car horns, distant sirens, and chatter filled the air. People were starting their day, rushing to work, grabbing coffee, or walking their dogs. The neighborhood was alive, vibrant, and full of energy. Among the crowd, Jamal West walked calmly, a contrast to the hurried pace around him. Jamal was in his mid-30s, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit. His polished shoes clicked against the pavement as he made his way down the street. A warm smile played on his lips as he adjusted the cuffs of his crisp white shirt. His presence commanded attention, not because he sought it, but because of the quiet confidence he exuded. He was the kind of man who turned heads without trying. He had just finished breakfast at a local diner, a place he frequented when he had time. The staff knew him by name, and they always made sure his order was just right: scrambled eggs, turkey bacon, and a side of fruit. As he approached his car, a sleek black sedan parked on the street, Jamal felt the familiar buzz of his phone in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from his mother, reminding him about their dinner plans that evening. Smiling, he typed out a quick reply, letting her know he hadn't forgotten. He was looking forward to it. Family was everything to him. Just as he was about to unlock his car, Jamal noticed two police officers walking towards him. Their eyes were fixed on him, and their expressions were hard, unreadable. Jamal didn't recognize them, but that wasn't surprising. New officers often rotated through the neighborhood. What was unusual, though, was the intensity of their gaze. Jamal had grown up knowing how to handle himself around the police, especially as a black man. His father had taught him early on to always stay calm, be respectful, and never give them a reason to escalate a situation. Those lessons were etched into his mind. "Excuse me, sir," one of the officers called out as they approached. Jamal stopped and turned to face them, still holding his phone in one hand. "Yes, officer," Jamal replied, his voice steady and polite. He noticed the name on the officer's badge, Riley. The other officer, Jenkins, stood slightly behind, his hand resting on his belt, near his holster. "Can I see some ID?" Riley asked, his tone sharp, almost demanding. There was no greeting, no explanation for why they had approached him. Jamal had been through situations like this before, but something about this encounter felt different. There was a tension in the air that made his instincts kick in. "May I ask why?" Jamal responded, keeping his voice calm. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but he also knew his rights. He hadn't done anything wrong, and there was no reason for them to ask for his identification. Riley's eyes narrowed, and a smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Just show us your ID, sir. It's a simple request." Jamal held the officer's gaze for a moment, then slowly reached into his jacket pocket. "All right," he said, pulling out his wallet. "But I'd still like to know why I'm being asked for it." As he handed over his driver's license, he noticed Jenkins shift slightly, as if preparing for something. Jamal's senses heightened, but he kept his composure. Riley took the ID and looked it over, but his expression didn't change. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Riley asked, his tone accusatory. Jamal's eyebrows furrowed slightly in confusion. "I'm just heading to my car," he answered truthfully. "Is there a problem?" Riley ignored the question. "Where are you coming from?" "I had breakfast at the diner down the street," Jamal replied. "Like I said, is there a problem, officer?" Riley's eyes flicked up to meet Jamal's, and there was a flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps, before he handed the ID back. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area," he said, the smirk returning. "You match the description of someone we're looking for." Jamal's stomach tightened. He knew where this was going. It was a familiar story. Black man in a nice neighborhood, dressed well, must be up to something. He had heard it all before, but it didn't make it any easier to deal with. "I see," Jamal said carefully. "Well, I'm sure it's a misunderstanding. I'm just here to get to my car and head to work. Riley didn't seem to hear him. Instead, he took a step closer, his posture more aggressive. What kind of work do you do? I'm a lawyer, Jamal replied, keeping his voice even. I have a meeting in an hour, so if there's nothing else, I'd like to be on my way. That seemed to catch Riley off guard. His smirk faltered, but only for a second. A lawyer, huh? You don't say. Jenkins, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. You sure you're not hiding anything? Got anything illegal in that car of yours? Jamal could feel the tension rising. He knew how these situations could spiral out of control. He had to stay calm, had to defuse it. There's nothing illegal in my car, officer. You're welcome to check, but I'd prefer if you didn't waste your time. I'm just trying to get to work. Riley's eyes hardened. You don't get to decide how we do our job. Step away from the car. Jamal hesitated. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but the situation was quickly becoming dangerous. He had to make a decision, comply and hope it didn't escalate further, or stand his ground and risk things getting worse. His father's voice echoed in his mind, urging him to stay calm, to be smart. All right, Jamal said slowly, raising his hand slightly to show he wasn't a threat. I'll step back. He took a step away from the car, and as he did, Riley moved closer, his hand now resting on the handle of his baton. Jamal's heart raced, but he kept his expression neutral. He couldn't let them see any fear. Without warning, Riley grabbed Jamal's arm and twisted it behind his back. The suddenness of the move caught Jamal off guard, and he winced in pain. Before he could react, Jenkins was on him too, forcing him down to the ground. Hey, what are you doing? Jamal protested, trying to keep his voice calm, but the pain in his shoulder made it difficult. He wasn't resisting, but the officers were treating him as if he was. You're under arrest for resisting arrest, Riley said coldly, as he tightened the cuffs around Jamal's wrists. Jamal's mind raced. Resisting arrest? He hadn't resisted anything. He had done everything they asked, tried to reason with them, tried to stay calm, but it didn't matter. They had made up their minds the moment they saw him. By now, the commotion had drawn the attention of people nearby. An elderly woman, Mrs. Agnes Carter, who lived in the apartment building across the street, watched in horror from her balcony. She knew Jamal. She had seen him in the neighborhood many times and knew he wasn't a troublemaker. What are you doing to him? She called out, her voice trembling with outrage. He didn't do anything wrong. A young couple walking their dog had also stopped to watch. The man pulled out his phone and started recording. This is messed up, he muttered to his girlfriend. They're arresting him for nothing. Jamal caught sight of the phone recording, and for a brief moment, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe the footage would help him later. Maybe it would show people the truth of what happened. But for now, he was powerless. As the officers pulled Jamal to his feet, he forced himself to stay calm, to focus. He knew he had to be careful with what he said next. Anything could be used against him. As they led him towards the police car, the crowd began to grow, more people stopping to watch, to record, to shout their disapproval at the officers. This isn't right, one man shouted from across the street. He didn't do anything, but Riley and Jenkins ignored them, their faces set with cold determination. They pushed Jamal into the back of the squad car, slamming the door shut behind him. Before they could drive away, Jamal turned his head to look out the window at the crowd. He could see the concern, the anger, the confusion on their faces. He took a deep breath, knowing he had to say something, even if it was just a few words. This isn't over, he said loudly, his voice carrying through the thin glass. This isn't over. The words hung in the air as the car pulled away, leaving the stunned crowd behind. Inside the car, Jamal's mind raced with thoughts of what would happen next, of how he would fight this, of how he would make sure justice was served. The police station was a stark contrast to the bustling streets outside. Cold, gray walls, harsh fluorescent lights, and the constant hum of activity set the scene. Officers moved briskly through the corridors, some chatting, others focused on their tasks. The station was busy, but there was an underlying tension in the air, the kind that made people speak in hushed tones and glance over their shoulders. Jamal West was led through the station's front doors, his hands still cuffed behind his back. Officer Riley and Officer Jenkins flanked him, their expressions unreadable. As they passed through the booking area, A few officers glanced up, their eyes narrowing slightly as they took in Jamal's appearance. He was clearly not the usual suspect they brought in, a well-dressed black man with an air of calmness that seemed out of place. "Over here," Riley barked, steering Jamal toward a desk where a tired-looking officer sat behind a computer. The officer glanced up, then down at the screen, barely acknowledging Jamal's presence. "Name?" the officer asked, his fingers poised over the keyboard. "Jamal West," Riley replied before Jamal could speak. The officer typed the name into the system, his eyes scanning the screen. He frowned slightly, but didn't say anything. Instead, he motioned for Riley to bring Jamal over to the fingerprinting station. "Let's get this over with," Riley muttered, pushing Jamal forward. Jamal didn't resist. He knew better than to give them any reason to make things worse. As they took his fingerprints, he remained silent, his mind racing. He couldn't believe this was happening. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, being treated like a criminal. But he knew he had to stay calm, had to think clearly. This wasn't the first time he had faced this kind of situation, and it likely wouldn't be the last. Once the fingerprinting was done, Riley and Jenkins led Jamal to a small holding cell at the back of the station. The cell was cramped, with a narrow bench along one wall and a metal toilet in the corner. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and something else, something sour and unpleasant. They uncuffed him and shoved him inside. "Make yourself comfortable," Jenkins sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You might be here for a while." Jamal sat down on the bench, taking a deep breath. He didn't respond to the taunts. There was no point. He knew they were trying to provoke him, trying to get a reaction. But he wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. As Riley and Jenkins walked away, they exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. They had done their job, brought in another troublemaker, and now they could move on to whatever came next. But there was something about this arrest that gnawed at Riley, something that made him uneasy. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the way Jamal had handled himself, the calmness, the confidence, it didn't fit the profile of someone they usually picked up. "Think he's a lawyer, huh?" Jenkins scoffed as they walked back to the front desk. "Probably just another punk with a fancy suit." "Yeah," Riley muttered, though his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't so sure anymore. Something about Jamal was off, but he couldn't figure out what it was. He shook his head, trying to push the thought away. It didn't matter. They had their orders, and they had followed them. That was all there was to it. But as they reached the desk, a young officer who had been quietly observing the scene stepped forward. His name was Officer Stevens, and he had been with the department for only a few months. He was eager to prove himself, to show that he could handle the job, but he was also smart, smarter than most gave him credit for. "Hey, Riley," Stevens called out, his voice low. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Riley glanced at him, frowning. "What is it?" Stevens hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "That guy you just brought in? Jamal West. I think I know who he is." Riley's frown deepened. "What are you talking about?" Stevens leaned in closer, lowering his voice even more. "I saw him in a news article a few weeks ago. He's not just a lawyer. He's a civil rights attorney. A pretty big deal, too. He's been involved in some major cases, high-profile stuff." Riley's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly masked his surprise. "Are you sure?" "Positive," Stevens replied. "I didn't recognize him at first, but when I heard the name, it clicked. You might want to be careful with this one. If he's who I think he is, this could blow up in our faces." Riley didn't respond immediately. He felt a knot form in his stomach, but he pushed it down. This couldn't be true. They had arrested him fair and square. There was no way he could be someone important. But the doubt was there now, nagging at him. "I'll handle it," Riley said curtly, dismissing Stevens with a wave of his hand. But as he turned away, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest. Stevens watched Riley walk off, then pulled out his phone. He quickly scrolled through his contacts, finding the number he needed. With a deep breath, he dialed, praying he was making the right decision. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Yeah, Captain, it's Stevens," he said, keeping his voice low. "We have a situation here at the station. I think you need to know about it." Meanwhile, back in the holding cell, Jamal sat quietly, his thoughts focused. He knew this wasn't just about him. This was about something bigger. He had been targeted, of that he was certain, but he didn't know why. As he waited, he kept his composure, refusing to let the fear take over. He had been through worse, and he knew he would get through this too. An hour passed before anything happened. The door to the holding area swung open, and a woman stepped inside. She was in her late 30s, with sharp eyes and an air of authority that made everyone take notice. Her name was Lieutenant Kate Thompson, and she was new to the station, having been transferred from another precinct just a few weeks earlier. She was still getting to know the team, but she had already made it clear that she was not someone to be underestimated. Thompson's gaze swept over the room, taking in the officers going about their business. She spotted Riley and Jenkins at the front desk, talking quietly among themselves. Something about their demeanor caught her attention. She had learned to trust her instincts, and right now, they were telling her that something was off. "Riley, Jenkins," she called out, walking over to them. "What's going on here?" Riley looked up, surprised to see her. "Nothing much, ma'am. Just another day." Thompson's eyes narrowed. "Really? Because I heard you brought someone in this morning. A man named Jamal West." Riley stiffened slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Yes, ma'am. We did." "And what was the charge?" she asked, her tone calm but probing. "Resisting arrest," Riley replied, his voice steady. "We had reason to believe he was involved in suspicious activity. When we questioned him, he refused to cooperate." Thompson raised an eyebrow. "Did he now?" Riley nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Thompson didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied Riley's face, searching for any sign that he was lying. She had dealt with officers like him before, men who thought they could bend the rules as long as it suited them. But she was different. She had come up through the ranks by doing things by the book, and she expected her team to do the same. "Take me to him," she said finally, her voice leaving no room for argument. Riley hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Right this way, ma'am." As they walked toward the holding cells, Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than Riley was letting on. When they reached Jamal's cell, she stopped, her gaze locking onto the man inside. He was sitting on the bench, his hands folded in his lap, his posture relaxed despite the circumstances. There was something about him, something that made her pause. "This is him?" she asked, turning to Riley. "Yes, ma'am," Riley confirmed. "Like I said, he resisted arrest, so we had no choice but to bring him in." Thompson didn't respond right away. Instead, she opened the cell door and stepped inside. Jamal looked up, meeting her gaze with calm, steady eyes. He didn't seem intimidated, but he also didn't seem defiant. He was just composed. "Mr. West," Thompson said, her voice measured. "I'm Lieutenant Kate Thompson. I'm here to ask you a few questions." "Of course, Lieutenant," Jamal replied politely. "I'm happy to cooperate." Thompson nodded, appreciating Jamal's calm demeanor. "I've been told that you resisted arrest, which led to your being brought in. I'd like to hear your side of the story." Jamal kept his gaze steady. "Lieutenant, I did no such thing. I complied with every instruction given to me by officers Riley and Jenkins. I was walking to my car when they stopped me. I asked them why I was being detained, and that simple question seemed to escalate the situation. Before I knew it, I was handcuffed and accused of resisting arrest, despite following their orders." Thompson listened carefully, her eyes narrowing slightly as she processed Jamal's words. There was something about his tone, calm, measured, but with an underlying firmness that suggested he wasn't just another man trying to talk his way out of trouble. She turned to Riley, who was standing a few feet behind her, his expression carefully neutral. "Is that true, Riley?" Thompson asked, her voice sharp. "Did Mr. West comply with your instructions?" Riley shifted uncomfortably. "Well, ma'am, he questioned us and things got tense. We had reason to believe he might be hiding something." Thompson's gaze hardened. "And what exactly was that reason?" Riley hesitated, unable to come up with a convincing response. "It was just a gut feeling, ma'am." "A gut feeling?" Thompson repeated, her tone incredulous. "Is that the basis for your arrest now?" Riley opened his mouth to respond, but was cut off by the sound of the holding area door opening again. All eyes turned as Officer Stevens entered, looking slightly out of breath. He paused when he saw the group in the cell, realizing he had walked into a tense situation. "Lieutenant, I need to speak with you," Stevens said quickly, glancing between Jamal and Riley. Thompson gave Riley a final hard look before stepping out of the cell and closing the door behind her. "What is it, Stevens?" Stevens lowered his voice, clearly trying to keep the conversation private. Ma'am, I've been doing some digging. Jamal West isn't just any lawyer. He's a prominent civil rights attorney. He's been involved in some big cases, the kind that make headlines. If word gets out that we arrested him without cause, it's going to be a disaster. Thompson felt her stomach drop. She had suspected there was more to this, but hearing the full scope of who Jamal was made the situation even more serious. Are you sure? Positive, Stevens replied, handing her his phone with a web page pulled up showing Jamal's profile. This is him. If we don't handle this carefully, we're going to have a lot more than just an internal investigation on our hands. Thompson quickly scanned the page, her eyes widening as she read about Jamal's background. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was a powerhouse in the legal community, someone who had taken on police departments, corporations, and government agencies. He was the kind of person who could turn this entire station upside down if they didn't tread carefully. She turned to look at Riley, who was still standing by the cell with Jenkins, both of them looking increasingly uneasy. Thompson knew she had to act fast. The situation was spiraling out of control, and she couldn't afford to let it get any worse. Riley, Jenkins, Thompson called out, walking back toward them with a sense of urgency. We need to talk now. The two officers exchanged a glance before following Thompson out of the holding area. Once they were in a more private part of the station, Thompson rounded on them, her expression fierce. Do you have any idea who you've just arrested? She demanded, keeping her voice low but intense. Jamal West isn't just some random guy off the street. He's a civil rights attorney with a reputation for taking on cases of police misconduct. If he decides to file a lawsuit against us, we're all going to be in serious trouble. Riley paled slightly, his bravado faltering. Ma'am, we didn't know. He didn't say anything about being a lawyer. It doesn't matter, Thompson snapped. You should have done your due diligence before bringing him in. Now we have to figure out how to handle this, and fast. As she spoke, the sound of raised voices from outside the station began to filter in. Thompson's head snapped up, her heart sinking as she realized what was happening. The crowd outside was growing larger, and they were getting louder. She could hear the unmistakable chants of protesters, demanding justice and Jamal's release. Great, Thompson muttered under her breath. Just what we needed. Stevens, who had been hovering nearby, stepped forward. Lieutenant, the community is already fired up about this. We've got activists, local leaders, and even some media starting to show up. If we don't do something soon, this could turn into a full-blown crisis. Thompson knew he was right. She had seen situations like this before, small incidents that escalated into something much bigger because they weren't handled properly. But this was different. This wasn't just about defusing a tense situation. It was about protecting the integrity of the police force and avoiding a legal and public relations nightmare. We need to get ahead of this, Thompson said decisively. Riley, Jenkins, I want you to prepare a full report on the arrest, detailing every step you took and why. I don't care how late we're here. Get it done. Stevens, I need you to help me figure out the best way to handle the press. We need to control the narrative before it gets out of hand. As the officers scattered to carry out her orders, Thompson felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had only been at the station for a few weeks, and already she was dealing with a potential disaster. But she wasn't about to let this ruin her career or the reputation of her department. Inside the holding cell, Jamal remained seated, his mind racing as he listened to the commotion outside. He could hear the crowd growing louder, their voices echoing through the station. He knew his family would be among them, along with the community leaders and activists who had always stood by him. They wouldn't let this go unanswered. A sense of hope flickered in his chest, but he knew it was too soon to feel relieved. The police were still in control, and they could easily manipulate the situation to their advantage. He had seen it happen before, and he wasn't about to underestimate them. Back in the front of the station, the tension continued to build. Outside, the crowd had swelled to over 100 people, with signs and banners demanding justice for Jamal. Reporters had arrived, their cameras trained on the scene, capturing every moment. The police station was becoming a flashpoint, a symbol of the growing unrest in the community. Lieutenant Thompson watched the scene unfold from the station's front window, her jaw clenched in frustration. She knew she had to do something, but she was walking a tightrope. One wrong move, and everything could explode. But if she did nothing, the situation would spiral out of control on its own. She turned to Stevens, who was standing beside her, looking equally concerned. "We need to release him," she said finally, her voice tight. "It's the only way to de-escalate this." Stevens nodded in agreement. "But how are we going to explain it to the media? They're not going to just accept that we let him go without an explanation." Thompson thought for a moment before answering. "We'll frame it as a misunderstanding. Say that after reviewing the evidence, we determined there was no basis for the arrest and decided to release him. We'll emphasize that we take these matters seriously and that we're committed to justice and fairness." It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best they had. With any luck, it would be enough to calm the crowd and prevent the situation from escalating further. Thompson knew it wouldn't be easy, but she had no other choice. She had to think about the bigger picture, the department, her career, and the potential fallout if they didn't handle this properly. Thompson turned away from the window and headed back to the holding area. She was determined to resolve this before it got any worse. As she walked through the station, she passed by Riley and Jenkins, who were furiously typing up their reports. She paused for a moment, her gaze hardening. "When this is over, we're going to have a long conversation about what went wrong here," she said coldly. "And trust me, it won't be pretty." Riley swallowed hard, nodding silently. He knew he was in deep trouble, but there was nothing he could do now except hope that Thompson could fix the mess they had created. When Thompson reached Jamal's cell, she opened the door herself, stepping inside with a measured calm. "Mr. West, I've reviewed the situation, and it's clear that there was a misunderstanding. You're free to go." Jamal stood slowly, his expression guarded. "A misunderstanding, Lieutenant? Is that what we're calling it?" Thompson met his gaze, refusing to flinch. "Yes, I'm deeply sorry for what happened here today. It shouldn't have gone this far." Jamal studied her for a moment, his sharp eyes searching for any sign of deceit. Finally, he nodded. "I appreciate your apology, Lieutenant, but you should know that this isn't over." Thompson didn't doubt it for a second. She knew Jamal West was not the kind of man to let something like this slide. But for now, her priority was getting him out of the station safely and defusing the situation outside. She escorted Jamal out of the holding area, past the tense officers who avoided his gaze. As they reached the front door, Thompson paused, taking a deep breath. "I'll do everything I can to make this right," she said quietly. Jamal nodded, but didn't reply. He stepped outside, where the crowd erupted into cheers at the sight of him. Cameras flashed, and reporters shouted questions. But Jamal ignored them, walking calmly toward his waiting family and friends. As he embraced his loved ones, Thompson watched from the doorway, her expression unreadable. She knew this was only the beginning. Jamal West would not let this go quietly, and the ripple effects of today's events would be felt for a long time. But for now, the immediate crisis was averted. The crowd was dispersing, the reporters were packing up, and the tension that had gripped the station was beginning to ease. Thompson knew she still had a long road ahead to fix the damage done, but she was determined to face it head-on. As Jamal walked away from the station, he knew this was just the start of a new battle. He had been wronged, but he also knew how to turn that wrong into something powerful. The truth would come out, and when it did, the police department and the town would never be the same. The tension in the police station had been palpable since Jamal West walked out the front doors. Lieutenant Kate Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was far from over. As she sat in her office, reviewing the preliminary reports from officers Riley and Jenkins, her thoughts kept drifting back to the man they had arrested. Something about the way Jamal had handled himself, calm, composed, almost expectant, nagged at her. She had a gut feeling there was more to this story. Thompson wasn't one to ignore her instincts. If she had learned anything during her years on the force, it was to trust her intuition, especially when things didn't add up. Outside her office, the station buzzed with the subdued energy that followed a major incident. Officers moved about, avoiding eye contact with one another, aware that they were still walking on eggshells. The crowd that had gathered outside earlier had mostly dispersed, but the damage was done. Everyone knew this wasn't just going to blow over. Thompson leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The silence in her office was a stark contrast to the turmoil in her mind. She knew she had to dig deeper, to understand who Jamal West really was and why his arrest had set off such a chain reaction. She couldn't afford to let this go unanswered, both for her own sake and for the integrity of the department. She reached for her computer, her fingers moving swiftly across the keyboard as she searched for more information on Jamal. The results that came up were eye-opening. Articles, news clips, and interviews painted a picture of a man who was much more than just a lawyer. Jamal West was a force to be reckoned with, a civil rights attorney who had taken on some of the most powerful entities in the country, winning cases that made headlines and changed lives. Thompson scrolled through the information, her eyes narrowing as she read about Jamal's most recent case, a high-profile lawsuit against a police department in another city. The case had exposed deep-seated corruption, leading to several officers being fired and others facing criminal charges. It had been a huge win for Jamal and his team, but it had also put him on the radar of law enforcement agencies across the country. As she delved deeper, Thompson came across a detail that made her blood run cold. Jamal West had been involved in a federal investigation into systemic racism within law enforcement. The investigation had led to federal oversight of several police departments, and there were rumors that more departments were being scrutinized. Thompson's heart pounded as she realized the implications. She quickly made a phone call to a contact she had in the FBI, someone she knew she could trust to give her information without blowing things out of proportion. The conversation was brief, but by the time she hung up, Thompson's suspicions had been confirmed. Jamal West was working undercover, gathering evidence for a federal case that could potentially bring down several high-ranking officials within the local law enforcement community, including her own department. Thompson sat back in her chair, her mind racing. This was far bigger than she had imagined. Jamal hadn't just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had been targeted, and the officers who arrested him had unknowingly walked right into a trap. If this got out, it would be a scandal of epic proportions. She knew she had to confront Riley and Jenkins, but first, she needed more information. She spent the next hour piecing together everything she could about Jamal's work, his connections, and the ongoing federal investigation. The more she uncovered, the more convinced she became that the situation was far more dangerous than anyone realized. Finally, Thompson stood up, taking a deep breath. She was about to walk into a storm, but she had no choice. She couldn't let her department go down because of someone else's mistake. As she made her way to the officer's bullpen, she steeled herself for the confrontation ahead. When she reached Riley and Jenkins, they were sitting at their desks, reviewing their reports. They looked up as she approached, sensing the tension in her posture. "Lieutenant," Riley greeted her, his tone guarded. "Is there something you need?" Thompson crossed her arms, fixing them with a hard stare. "We need to talk. Now." The two officers exchanged a glance before nodding. They followed her to an empty conference room, where Thompson closed the door behind them. The room was stark, with nothing but a long table and a few chairs. It was the kind of room where difficult conversations happened, and both officers knew this wasn't going to be pleasant. "Lieutenant, what's this about?" Jenkins asked, trying to sound casual, but the tension in his voice betrayed his nerves. Thompson didn't waste any time. "I know who Jamal West is." Riley's eyes widened, and Jenkins stiffened. Neither of them said anything, but Thompson could see the flicker of panic in their expressions. They hadn't known who they were dealing with, and now it was coming back to haunt them. "Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you've caused?" Thompson continued, her voice low and dangerous. "Jamal West is a civil rights attorney and a federal asset. He's been working undercover to gather evidence on police corruption, evidence that could implicate this department." Riley's face drained of color. "We didn't know, Lieutenant. He didn't say anything about being undercover. We thought he was just another." "Just another what?" Thompson snapped. "Just another black man you could push around without consequences?" Jenkins flinched, looking down at his feet. Riley opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Thompson could see the realization dawning on them, the weight of what they had done settling in. "You two have put us all at risk," Thompson said, her tone icy. "Not just the department, but the entire city. If this investigation blows up, we're all going down with it." Riley finally found his voice. "Lieutenant, we didn't know." We were just following protocol. Protocol? Thompson cut him off, her voice rising. What protocol? You arrested a man without cause. You treated him like a criminal. And now we're in the middle of a federal investigation that could destroy everything we've worked for. This isn't just about you anymore. This is about the entire department. Jenkins looked like he was about to be sick. What do we do now, Lieutenant? Before Thompson could answer, the door to the conference room burst open, and Chief of Police Frank Daniels stormed in. His face was flushed with anger, his eyes blazing as he took in the scene before him. Lieutenant Thompson, he barked, his voice booming. What the hell is going on here? Thompson straightened, meeting the chief's furious gaze. Chief, we have a serious problem. Jamal West is... I know exactly who Jamal West is, Chief Daniels interrupted, his voice dripping with venom. And I know exactly what kind of mess you've made, Thompson. Thompson blinked in surprise. Chief, Save it, Daniels snapped, cutting her off again. Do you have any idea what kind of position you've put this department in? We got a civil rights attorney working undercover in our city, and you've just handed him all the ammunition he needs to take us down. This is a disaster, and it's on you. Thompson's jaw tightened. With all due respect, Chief, it's not just on me. Officers Riley and Jenkins made the arrest without cause, and now we're all paying the price. Daniel's eyes flicked to Riley and Jenkins, his expression hardening. We'll deal with them later. Right now, we need to focus on damage control. Thompson nodded, trying to stay composed. I've already started looking into the situation. There's a federal investigation into systemic racism within law enforcement, and it's tied to recent federal oversight of local police. Jamal West has been gathering evidence for that investigation, and if we don't handle this carefully, it could destroy us. Daniel's anger simmered just beneath the surface, but he kept it in check. What's our next move? Before Thompson could respond, there was a knock on the conference room door. A young officer poked his head in, looking nervous. Chief, Lieutenant, there's someone here to see you. He says it's urgent. Daniels frowned. Who is it? The officer swallowed. A federal agent. His name is Williams. The room fell silent as the weight of those words settled in. Thompson exchanged a tense glance with the chief. This was the moment they had been dreading. Send him in, Daniels ordered, his voice tight. The young officer nodded and disappeared down the hallway. A moment later, the door opened again, and Agent Mark Williams stepped inside. He was a tall, imposing man with a stern expression and an air of authority that commanded attention. His dark suit was impeccably tailored, and the badge clipped to his belt gleamed in the fluorescent light. Chief Daniels, Lieutenant Thompson, Agent Williams greeted them curtly, his eyes scanning the room. We need to talk. Daniels squared his shoulders, trying to maintain control of the situation. Agent Williams, I'm sure we can explain. Williams held up a hand, silencing him. There's no need for explanations, Chief. I'm well aware of what's happened here. And let me be clear, this is a very serious matter. Thompson felt her pulse quicken as she studied the agent. There was no mistaking the severity in his tone. Whatever was about to happen, it was going to be significant. Jamal West is a key asset in a federal investigation, Williams continued, his voice measured. An investigation that has been months in the making. His arrest was a mistake that could have far-reaching consequences if not handled properly. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. We understand that, Agent Williams. We're prepared to cooperate fully. Good, Williams replied, his tone clipped. Because right now, your cooperation is the only thing that's going to keep this situation from escalating further. Thompson's mind raced as she tried to grasp the full extent of what was happening. This wasn't just about Jamal West anymore. This was about the entire department, the entire city. And if they didn't tread carefully, it could all come crashing down. Williams' gaze hardened as he addressed the room. You will provide him with a formal apology on behalf of the department. Any resistance to these orders will be met with swift and decisive action. Daniel's face flushed with anger, but he nodded stiffly. Understood. Williams turned to Thompson, his expression unreadable. Lieutenant, I expect you to oversee this personally. Make sure there are no further incidents. Thompson nodded, her mouth dry. I'll take care of it. With that, Williams gave a curt nod and turned to leave. But before he exited the room, He paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "And one more thing," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "Consider this your warning. The federal government is watching closely. Any further misconduct within this department will not be tolerated." As the door closed behind him, the room was left in stunned silence. Thompson felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her, suffocating in its intensity. She knew the road ahead was going to be treacherous, but she also knew she had no choice but to navigate it. The atmosphere at the police station was heavy with tension as the day wore on. The events of the morning had set off a chain reaction that no one could have anticipated, and now everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The news of Jamal West's wrongful arrest had spread like wildfire, igniting outrage not just within the community, but across the entire city. Protests had erupted outside the station, with activists, community leaders, and concerned citizens demanding justice. Inside, Chief Frank Daniels was trying to salvage what was left of his reputation. He knew the department was on the brink of a public relations disaster, and the only way to prevent it from spiraling out of control was to make a public apology. But he also knew that a simple apology might not be enough to quell the anger that had been brewing for years. In his office, Chief Daniels sat at his desk, staring at the phone. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the receiver, dialing the number for the public relations team. He needed to prepare a statement, something that would show the community that the department was taking this seriously. But deep down, he knew that no amount of carefully crafted words could undo the damage that had been done. When the PR team answered, Daniels spoke in a low, measured tone. "I need you to draft a public apology. We're going to address the media outside the station this afternoon." "Understood, Chief. We'll prepare something immediately," the voice on the other end replied. Daniels hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. He felt the weight of his decisions pressing down on him, the consequences of years of looking the other way when officers like Riley and Jenkins crossed the line. He had always told himself that it was just part of the job, that sometimes you had to make compromises to keep the peace. But now, those compromises were coming back to haunt him. A knock on the door pulled Daniels from his thoughts. Lieutenant Kate Thompson stood in the doorway, her expression tense but determined. She said, "Chief, Jamal West is waiting outside with the crowd." Daniels nodded, forcing himself to stand. "Good. I'm going out there to make the apology." Thompson hesitated, then stepped forward. "Chief, I need to tell you something before you go out there." Daniels raised an eyebrow. "What is it, Thompson?" She took a deep breath. "I've uncovered evidence of systemic corruption within the department. Bribery, cover-ups, racial profiling. This goes beyond just Riley and Jenkins. It's been happening for years, and it's been swept under the rug." Daniels felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you sure?" Thompson nodded. "I've already started gathering the evidence. With Jamal's help and the federal oversight team, we can start cleaning up this mess. But it's going to be a long and difficult process." Daniels exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her words. "Then we do what we have to do. It's time to face the consequences of our actions." Thompson gave a small nod of approval. "I'll back you up out there, Chief. We need to show the community that we're serious about change." Daniels didn't reply, but the look in his eyes said everything. He knew this wasn't just about saving face anymore. This was about survival. If they didn't act now, the entire department could be dismantled. Together, they walked out of the office and headed toward the front of the station. As they approached the doors, they could hear the sound of the crowd outside. Angry voices demanding justice, chanting for accountability. Daniels felt his stomach knot with anxiety, but he kept his expression neutral as he pushed open the doors and stepped out into the sunlight. The crowd fell silent as they saw him, cameras clicking, microphones thrust forward. Reporters called out questions, but Daniels ignored them, focusing on the podium that had been set up for the press conference. He could see Jamal standing among the crowd, his expression unreadable, his presence commanding attention. Daniels cleared his throat and stepped up to the microphone, adjusting it slightly. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, judging him, waiting to see what he would say. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady but strained. "I want to start by acknowledging the events that took place earlier today. The arrest of Mr. Jamal West was a mistake, one that should never have happened. I take full responsibility for what occurred, and I want to offer my sincerest apologies to Mr. West and to the community. The crowd murmured, a mixture of skepticism and anger rippling through the air. Daniels could feel the pressure building, the weight of decades of mistrust bearing down on him. We recognize that this incident is part of a larger problem, Daniels continued, his tone somber. A problem that has persisted for far too long within our department. I want to assure you all that we are committed to addressing these issues head-on. Effective immediately, Officers Riley and Jenkins have been suspended pending an internal investigation. We will be conducting a thorough review of our practices and procedures, and we will work closely with federal oversight to ensure that we are holding ourselves to the highest standards of accountability. The crowd was quiet now, listening intently, but Daniels could see the doubt in their eyes, the wariness that came from years of broken promises. I know that words alone are not enough, Daniels said, his voice faltering slightly. We have a lot of work to do to rebuild the trust that has been lost, but I want you to know that we are committed to making the necessary changes. We will work with community leaders, activists, and organizations to create a department that serves and protects everyone, regardless of race or background. He paused, searching for the right words to end his statement. But before he could continue, Jamal West stepped forward, raising a hand to stop him. Chief Daniels, Jamal said, his voice calm but firm. I appreciate the apology, but this isn't just about words. This is about action. True justice goes beyond a public apology. It requires real change, real accountability, and real commitment. Daniels nodded slowly, stepping back from the microphone. He knew that Jamal was right. An apology was just the beginning, and the real work was still ahead of them. Jamal turned to face the crowd, his presence commanding their full attention. We've heard apologies before, he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. But what we need now is a commitment to real, lasting change. We need to hold those in power accountable for their actions, and we need to work together to create a system that treats everyone with fairness and dignity. The crowd erupted in applause, voices rising in agreement. Jamal's words resonated with them, cutting through the anger and frustration that had been building for so long. This isn't just about what happened to me, Jamal continued, his voice strong and clear. This is about all of us. It's about every person who has been wronged by a system that's supposed to protect them. It's about making sure that no one else has to go through what I went through. And it's about ensuring that justice is not just a word, but a reality. The crowd cheered, and Jamal paused, letting the energy of the moment wash over him. He could see the hope in their eyes, the desire for something better. It was a powerful feeling, one that he knew he couldn't ignore. Change doesn't happen overnight, Jamal said, his tone more measured now. It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes all of us working together. But I believe that we can make it happen. I believe that we can build a better future, not just for ourselves, but for the generations that will come after us. As the applause swelled, Jamal stepped back from the podium, his message delivered. The crowd's response was overwhelming, a surge of support that filled him with determination. He knew this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey, but he was ready for it. He was ready to lead the fight for justice, to hold those in power accountable, and to ensure that the voices of the marginalized were heard. As Jamal made his way through the crowd, embracing friends and supporters, Lieutenant Thompson watched from the steps of the station. She felt a mixture of relief and resolve. Relief that the immediate crisis had been averted, and resolve to see the changes through. She knew that the department had a long road ahead, but with people like Jamal West leading the charge, she believed they could make it. Thompson turned to Chief Daniels, who was still standing by the podium, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and determination. We have a lot of work to do, she said quietly. Daniels nodded, his eyes fixed on the crowd. Yes, we do, but we'll get through this. As the crowd began to disperse, Thompson noticed a figure lingering at the edge of the gathering. The man was tall, dressed in a dark suit, with an air of quiet authority. He watched Jamal with an intense gaze, his expression unreadable. Curious, Thompson made her way over to the man. Can I help you? She asked. The man turned to her, his eyes sharp and focused. "I'm here to speak with Mr. West," he said, his voice low and controlled. "I have a message for him." Thompson frowned, studying the man more closely. There was something about him that put her on edge, something she couldn't quite place. "Who are you?" The man smiled slightly, but the warmth didn't reach his eyes. "Just someone who has a vested interest in seeing justice done." Before Thompson could respond, the man turned and walked toward Jamal, disappearing into the crowd. She watched him go, a sense of unease settling in her gut. Whoever he was, she had a feeling this wasn't the last time they would see him. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the station steps, Thompson knew that the events of the day were just the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, and the road ahead was filled with uncertainty. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could finally start to make things right. Across the city, in a small community center, another important meeting was taking place. Jamal sat at a table surrounded by a diverse group of individuals, community leaders, activists, legal experts, and concerned citizens. They were hammering out the details of the Community Justice Initiative, debating strategies and priorities. "We need to focus on education," argued Maria Hernandez, a local school teacher. "If we want lasting change, we have to start with the youth." "I agree," said Dr. James Carter, a sociology professor at the City University. "But we can't ignore the immediate needs of those currently suffering under an unjust system. We need a multi-pronged approach." Jamal listened carefully to each perspective, taking notes and asking questions. He was impressed by the passion and expertise in the room. This was exactly what he had hoped for, a collaborative effort that drew on the strengths of the entire community. As the meeting progressed, they began to form concrete plans. They would establish a legal aid clinic to provide free representation to those who couldn't afford it. They would develop a community oversight board to work alongside the police department's internal affairs division. They would create educational programs for schools and community centers, focusing on civil rights, civic engagement, and conflict resolution. By the time the meeting adjourned, everyone felt energized and focused. They had a long road ahead, but they had taken the first steps together. As the weeks turned into months, the city began to see small but significant changes. The police department, under the watchful eye of Lieutenant Thompson and the newly established Oversight Board, implemented new training programs focused on de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. Officers like Stevens, who had shown a genuine desire to improve, were given opportunities to work directly with community leaders and social workers. The Community Justice Initiative, meanwhile, had hit the ground running. Their legal aid clinic had already taken on dozens of cases, providing representation to individuals who had been wrongfully arrested or subjected to police misconduct. The educational programs were being piloted in several schools, with plans to expand citywide. But perhaps the most significant change was in the atmosphere of the city itself. There was a sense of engagement, of people coming together to address long-standing issues. Neighborhood watch groups were collaborating with police officers to improve safety without resorting to racial profiling. Community forums were being held regularly, providing a platform for open dialogue between citizens and local officials. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were still incidents of misconduct, still moments of tension and mistrust. Change was a slow process, and there were those who resisted it at every turn. But the difference now was that there were systems in place to address these issues, to hold people accountable, and to keep pushing forward. 6 months after the incident that had sparked it all, Jamal found himself back at the police station. This time, however, he wasn't there as a suspect or a victim, but as a partner. He had been invited to speak at a training session for new recruits, to share his perspective and help shape the next generation of officers. As he walked through the halls, Jamal couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. The atmosphere in the station was different. There was still the bustle of activity, but there was also a sense of openness that hadn't been there before. Officers greeted him with nods of respect, some even stopping to shake his hand. Lieutenant Thompson met him at the door to the training room. "Thank you for coming, Mr. West," she said, extending her hand. "I think your perspective will be invaluable for these recruits." Jamal shook her hand, noting the genuine warmth in her eyes. "I'm glad to be here," he replied. And please call me Jamal." As they entered the room, Jamal saw rows of young faces looking up at him. Some seemed curious, others a bit wary. He understood their hesitation. He represented a challenge to the way things had always been done. But he also saw in them the potential for real change. "Good morning," he began, his voice calm and steady. "My name is Jamal West, and I'm here to talk to you about justice. Not just the kind of justice you'll be sworn to uphold, but the kind of justice that goes beyond badges and courtrooms. The kind of justice that's about treating every person you encounter with dignity and respect." As he spoke, sharing his experiences and insights, Jamal could see the recruits listening intently. They asked thoughtful questions, engaged in respectful debate, and seemed genuinely interested in learning how to be better officers. After the session, as Jamal was gathering his notes, one of the recruits approached him. She was young, barely out of her teens, with a determined set to her jaw. "Mr. West," she said, her voice slightly hesitant, "I just wanted to thank you for coming today. I joined the force because I wanted to make a difference, to help people. But after everything that's happened, I started to wonder if I was making a mistake. Listening to you today, it reminded me why I'm here." Jamal smiled, touched by her sincerity. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sarah," she replied. "Sarah Johnson." "Well, Sarah," Jamal said, "I'm glad you're here. The department needs people like you, people who want to make a difference, who are willing to question and learn. Don't lose that spirit." As Sarah walked away, Jamal felt a surge of hope. It was people like her, he realized, who would ultimately determine whether the changes they were fighting for would last. Later that evening, Jamal sat in his office at the Community Justice Initiative, reviewing case files and reports. The work was never-ending, but he found it deeply fulfilling. Each small victory, each life improved, made all the long hours and sleepless nights worth it. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see Maria Hernandez, the teacher who had been instrumental in developing their educational programs. "Jamal," she said, excitement evident in her voice. "I just got out of a meeting with the school board. They've approved our curriculum for all high schools in the district." Jamal stood up, a broad smile spreading across his face. "That's fantastic news, Maria. Your hard work is really paying off." Maria beamed, but then her expression turned more serious. "It's all of our hard work, Jamal. None of this would be happening without you, without what you went through." Jamal shook his head. "I may have been the catalyst, but this movement is so much bigger than me. It's about all of us working together to create the change we want to see." As they discussed the details of the curriculum rollout, Jamal felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was what real change looked like, not just protests and speeches, but concrete actions that would shape the future of their community. Later that night, as Jamal finally headed home, he paused for a moment outside the office. The street was quiet, the city settling into its nighttime rhythm. He thought about how much had changed in just 6 months and how much work still lay ahead. But as he looked up at the stars twinkling in the clear night sky, Jamal felt a sense of peace wash over him. They were on the right path, he knew. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be setbacks along the way. But as long as they kept pushing forward, kept working together, they could build the kind of community they all dreamed of, one where justice wasn't just a word, but a lived reality for everyone. With renewed determination, Jamal started walking home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. And he was ready to face them one step at a time. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to my channel. I put in a lot of time and effort crafting these heartfelt narratives, and your support truly means the world to me. Thank you for being a part of this journey.